Hello, everybody. Welcome to our fourth session in our interdisciplinary workshop on voluntary assisted dying. My name's Paul Komesaroff, and I'm very pleased to be with you again today. The topic of today's session is on the social impacts of voluntary assisted dying. And as in the previous three sessions, we've got a number of speakers and then a panel discussion to which everyone will be warmly invited to contribute. Before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're situated around Australia, and to express my respect for the elders past and present. The four speakers include Camille La Brooy, Ian, in this order, Ian Kerridge, Nicole Hewlett, John Boffa and Ian Olver, and I'll introduce everyone very briefly just before they talk. I've asked the speakers, as previously, to limit themselves to about 5 minutes, with the idea that they're being called upon not to deliver a fully developed argument, but rather to make some provocations, as we've been calling them, to stimulate discussion in the time that follows. The panelists, you can see before you, I'm not going to introduce them again. I think you've met all of them previously, and I'll ask them to feel free to jump in and make comments if and when they wish to do so. For participants, if you put up your hand or indicate that you'd like to make a comment, we'll invite you to come on screen and then actually state your questions, and I might even invite a few people to comment anyway. So we're going to start with Camille, as we usually do. As you know, Camille's the coordinating researcher for the project. And Camille is going to give us a little bit of an overview of the data that we've collected in relation to the broad topic of the social impact of voluntary assisted dying. Thanks, Camille.
Thanks, Paul. So hi, everyone. As with the questions, I'm going to be presenting a bit of an overview of our results, as Paul said, and obviously there's going to be some overlapping themes with the other sessions, and I'm just going to be signposting the ideas that will hopefully spark some discussion about the impact of VAD on society. And as I've gone through the methods in previous sessions, I won't be repeating them today. So in terms of our findings, there was a lot of discussion about aged care and how many people, patients, carers and medical professionals tended to express the idea that there was fear about going into aged care, and VAD seemed to be, for some patients, a preferable option than having to be put into care. And this was particularly felt to be the case during COVID-related lockdowns. There was also the sense that people were opting for VAD out of loneliness. And this was an observation from clinicians. And it was also mentioned by patients, for example, who had no family members or a partner or someone that they had to care for them. And so while most people in our patient cohort did have someone that was caring for them, those who didn't spoke about the challenges of being in care settings with no real peers. And carers looking after someone who was perhaps a distant association also spoke about the challenge of being a support person, where they were less close to and sometimes felt more conflicted with their the patient decision. And there was also discussion about loneliness at end of life more broadly, and how some patients discussed wishing they'd never told people about the illness, as it was the veritable elephant in the room, and how people started to treat them differently, and how this impacted their relationships. And this obviously raised questions about how we care for vulnerable people in our society. COVID-19 affected the delivery of VAD and impacted on patient and carer experiences in numerous ways, as we've previously discussed with the federal carrier law preventing telehealth. But it also compounded a sense of loneliness as visits were nearly impossible with lockdowns. And the sense was that this was a bad time to be dying, as they were being robbed of precious moments, fulfilling bucket lists, etc. Others expressed the idea that it gave general public an insight into what they were going through, and that there was, because they were having to isolate prior to lockdown and prior to COVID in any case. So for some people, it didn't change their lives too much, but simply gave others an insight into what their lives were like. There were also findings about the relationship between law and medicine and how the law can shift medical practice. For example, the acceptance of VAD 1 year on showed the power of the law in this field. And this was felt to be positive for some, but troubling for others. There were also findings about costs and VAD, and there was a sense that VAD associated costs were difficult to measure, and no one really knew what was going on with costs and opportunity costs of the advent of VAD. There were fears that VAD could potentially detract from palliative care funding. While there was no evidence of this, there was discussion about VAD patients and how sometimes they were felt to be treated better, creating the so-called VIP patient phenomenon, because staff were careful not to be an instigating factor in the person taking their VAD medication, for example, or rooms being kept specifically for VAD patients to take their medication. Another finding was that VAD illustrates that conversations about death and dying could be improved in society more broadly. And many people felt that VAD's introduction created an opportunity to speak about wishes, hopes, and wants at end of life more broadly. A key finding that I think would be important, or at least interesting to discuss, is the fact that there was no clear relationship between religion and VAD. Views in favour of VAD came from both religious and non-religious people. However, it seemed that that views against VAD seemed to be reduced frequently to being religiously determined by proponents. So religion was instrumentalised in this way to discount opposing views, positing them sometimes as irrational. And there was also a lot of disparaging of decision-making from faith-based institutions, although the reality of what was taking place at faith-based institutions on the ground vis-a-vis patients who were making VAD requests was quite nuanced. So in terms of the impact of VAD on society, this raises questions about the acceptance of religious-based decision-making in multicultural societies. And I think that that will be interesting to discuss later. So that's all from me. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much, Camille. I should have said before that on our program, Danny Vadasz was going to speak tonight. He's the director of the Health Issues Centre, but unfortunately he's fallen ill with COVID and sends his apologies. And I'm sure everyone would be supportive of my sending my best wishes to Danny for a speedy recovery. Our next speaker is Ian Kerridge. Ian is a haematologist at the Royal North Shore Hospital and an ethicist at Sydney University and a CI on this project. Thanks, Ian. You have to unmute yourself, Ian.
Okay, so first thing, can you see my slides?
We can, but can you put them on slideshow?
Okay, I thought they were. Hold on. Okay, they're on slideshow now?
No.
Oh, okay.
Would you like me to share my screen and do that? Or are you happy just to do it like this?
No, I'll do them like this. Sorry about that. Not quite sure that's why that's not working. Okay, so look, I thought I'd just speak a little bit about the sort of the genesis of the debate around VAD and how it's changed and how I think it's perhaps likely to change. The history of VAD debates is not a pretty one. It's generally been characterised by polemic, by dogmatism, and by entrenched positions, and by lack of communication between different positions. And the arguments have often been pretty unsophisticated. On the one hand, there's been a single clinical problem, dying, and on the other hand, by different parts of, or different proponents or advocates of VAD, either one solution. So it's either VAD or palliative care. But these embody a whole range of overstatements, you know, either that suffering and dying is always intolerable or is always unrelievable, or alternatively that all symptoms are relievable, that VAD is uncomplicated, or alternatively is unnecessary because our existing legal structures allow it, or our existing ethical, if you want, vagueness allows physicians to do this. And as Camille says, overstatements or oversimplifications about religion and culture as well, that a particular religion or faith tradition leads to particular thinking about VAD, either for or classically against VAD as well, and that's problematic. What's been interesting about what's happened in Australia in the last sort of 6 years or so, and this was not a feature of the discussion around the Northern Territory VAD, is that there's been a whole series of things that have been different to what I've described. The public debate has been pretty extensive. The parliamentary debate was extensive. The consultation, particularly in Victoria, less so in other states, but certainly in Victoria and Western Australia, was extensive, with a particular desire to engage different viewpoints and groups, including from palliative care, religious groups, disability groups, peak bodies, carer groups, and the like. There has been consistent empirical data used here as well, the vast majority of which has been supportive of VAD, and there's been pretty extensive professional debate, both use of professional debate and empirical data from here, but also from Australia. And then ultimately, of course, it culminated in an important part of democracy, but something that doesn't happen very often, which is conscience votes. So I want to suggest that all of those things sort of really embody 4 different aspects of the VAD debate. The first is that the idea that ethical authority follows not from statement about a particular view, but from process. Is that we could have more or less ethically acceptable or ethically legitimate policy if it's inclusive, if it's transparent, if it's rigorous, and there's a clear review process. And I think that's been transformative in terms of the VAD debate. But the second is that it's occurred in a particular political context. In other words, is that our political structure is characterised by tolerance, by pluralism, and by liberalism. And that means that you're sort of obliged to take on board differing and sincerely held viewpoints, take them in good faith, and then argue about them in a public sphere. And I think that's happened as well, and that's been a real change. What follows from that also is the idea that actually positions for or against VAD are actually based on pretty much shared ethical commitments: care, compassion, respect, liberty, and agency. And then the last is a rejection of the idea, and this has been put by some ethical thinkers in this country, but really a rejection of the idea that VAD has emerged from an anti-democratic process. So the idea that it's discriminatory because it's excluded particular groups, or the conclusions have been inconsistent with particular groups. And this is a position that Margot Somerville and others have advanced, the idea that our ideas about VAD have discriminated against a Christian minority. And arguably that's wrong on so many levels, that even the idea that there is a Christian minority is fairly illogical in my view. So put another way, I think these are the things that have characterised where we're up to. We've got to the point where we think force of argument is important, both in terms of its logic and its use of evidence. We've got to the point that we think a process makes something more or less legitimate, and VAD arguably is legitimate because it's adopted a fairly ethical process. And then the last one is that it's a manifestation of democracy. So it's probably arguably the best that we can do. It's been respectful, it's been fairly tolerant, there's been a desire to accommodate different viewpoints, and it's left open the possibility of change. Okay, a couple of things that this doesn't mean though, and then I'll finish up with some suggestions about where the debate could go or is starting to go from here. None of this means that the law should be settled or the law is final. Is that, as we've discussed last week in our discussion of the law in Victoria, is if a law is illogical, unethical, contradictory, then it should be contested, fought over and overturned. Secondly, is that it doesn't mean that ethical authority is just about adding up the numbers. It is about reflection on values, about ethical principles and force of argument. The third thing is that it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be bad consequences. And this is that there may well be bad consequences as a result of bad legislation in Victoria or elsewhere around the country, and we have to be cognizant of that. And the last one, and there was discussion about this last week, is the idea that VAD is ethically done and dusted, right? You know, we can, you know, my work here is done kind of situation, right? I mean, VAD isn't ethically sorted, and hopefully, arguably, it shouldn't ever be. A bit like consent, that's not ethically sorted. Research and research ethics, that's not sorted. Treatment and non-treatment decisions, these are never completely settled. They're never something that we can say, we used to be concerned about the ethics of end-of-life treatment, but that's now completely sorted. We've moved on to something else. We've moved on to, you know, gene therapy for bizarre conditions or what have you. That arguably isn't the case, and we need to force ourselves to come back. So lastly, where is the debate going? Well, here's some suggestions about how it's sort of transforming on the basis of all of these things. The first is that it follows from audit and review, and Paul's talked about this on a number of occasions, that we do have to keep asking ourselves, is VAD actually achieving its goals? And both the simple ones, but more overarching or political goals as well. Has it improved care? Has it improved respect? Is it being delivered equitably? Is it working from that side of things? The second is that we have to have further discussions about, not just about whether it's working and achieving good things, but whether it's achieving bad things as well. So is it harming in any way patients, families, health workers, the system or our culture? And we need to ask whether it's creating distress of any kind. The third is that, and it follows again from audit and review, do we need to reform our legal processes and structures, as has occurred in Belgium and Canada and different parts of Europe and other types of VAD systems? And if we do, we have to ensure that the process by which we make those decisions has as much probity as the political structures that led to it in the first place. And the last ones are just ongoing reflection and the need for this. And again, as I mentioned, I don't think these are ethically settled. So we have to use this as an opportunity for ongoing reflection about suffering, about dying, about death, and about meaning creation, but also about the political and professional issues, about the healthcare system, about health professions, and particularly what palliative care means, about the moral functions of our healthcare system, the relationship between religion and healthcare delivery, and about VAD as a solution to a particular problem as well. So I think this is where things are starting to go, and I would hope that we continue to go that way. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Ian.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. Can you just stop sharing your screen now?
Yeah.
Thanks. Our next speaker is Nicole Hewlett, who is a proud Palawa woman and a researcher at Queensland University. Nicole works as a knowledge translator in the First Nations Cancer and Wellbeing team, as well as in the Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Assessment and Diagnosis Collaborative team. Thanks for joining us, Nicole. Over to you.
Thank you. And Palajina Naranina too. Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Nicole Hewlett, and I am a proud Palawa woman from Lutruwita, Tasmania. And today and every day, I would like to acknowledge that we all stand in millennia of footsteps old, and may we always acknowledge those that have come before us, those of today and those of tomorrow, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since men and women awoke from the great dream. I'm in Meanjin, Brisbane, today on the sovereign and unceded lands of Turrbal and Yagara people. And I'd like to pay my deepest respect to elders past, present and emerging, and of course extend this respect to any First Nations brothers and sisters that are listening today. We want to honour the presence of these ancestors who reside in the imagination of this land and whose irrepressible spirituality throws through all of this creation. And I say that because our elders have really laid down the foundation, and the perspectives that I bring you today are built around many yarns that we've had with our elders across the country. And when it comes to voluntary assisted dying and the social implications from a First Nations perspective, it's important to highlight that it's my perspective. It isn't all of our people's perspective because of the diversity within our culture. And with that huge diversity, any given topic provides a range of answers. There's huge perspectives and differences within families, let alone between communities. And when it comes to VAD, similar to any culture or religion, for some of our people, VAD is not their ways of knowing, being and doing, and it's utterly inappropriate. But for others, perhaps even it's triggering, given the history of this country. And then for others, it's the ultimate self-determination. And in fact, some communities that I visited and have been yarning with already practice VAD. And they have been practicing VAD in accordance with their law, LORE law, for thousands of years. So the diversity of perspectives is then, layered, I suppose, with religion that's been introduced with to our community. So the Torres Straits have huge Christianity up there, and that complicates, perspectives or diversifies perspectives even more so, as well as, Islam and Buddhism. And these faiths and these religions and frameworks often blend with our own Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews. So they're not even, perhaps in the purest sense of the Western religions or the Eastern religions. But when it comes to VAD for our people, this is not where we can begin the yarn, because we're nowhere near, I suppose, discussing cultural considerations of the VAD policy, because the legislation is not, for our people in any way. All of these debates have been largely between non-Indigenous peoples in a non-Indigenous system with non-Indigenous policies and laws. So when that happens, it's legislation like that is developed on assumptions that we all have equitable access to healthcare, that we have equity in our life expectancies, that we present early in our diagnoses of life-limiting illnesses, which we know for our people we don't. That all healthcare staff are culturally responsive and know how to talk to our people on incredibly sensitive issues or even not sensitive issues. There's assumptions that there isn't significant grief, loss and trauma that perpetuates the prevalence of suicide and triggers our people when we are confronted with yarning about death and dying. And also there's assumptions that the decisions like this belong to an individual rather than shared among, family or kinship systems that we have reciprocal roles and responsibilities with. And perhaps more importantly, VAD legislation like this assumes that there's no racism in the health system and that we trust the health care system that we're in and the people working within it. Now, I could obviously go on, but I would love to be able to say that, our people can access VAD and have these decisions, informed decisions made, the opportunity to have those, to make that decision, I suppose, at this time of life. But when we've got such a long way to even go, around breaking down the barriers to accessing the health system, let alone palliative care, let alone accessing palliative care early as well, before we have that opportunity to have the privilege of making an informed decision about VAD. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Our next speaker is John Boffa. John is the Chief Medical Officer at the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress. I think you're an Associate Professor at the University of South Australia. Did I get that correct?
Curtin.
Curtin.
It's in Perth.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, look, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Central Aranda people on the land on which I'm talking to you from, and their elders past, present, emerging. And just make it clear that I'm going to be talking to you from my perspective, and that Congress where I work doesn't have a position on euthanasia. But I think I can tell a story which will be useful for the discussion we're going to have, and build on the comment just made by Nicole about racism in the health system. So I've been practicing, I went to Tennant Creek in 1988, worked for Underneath Congress, the Aboriginal Health Services, have been working in Aboriginal community controlled health services up here ever since. So I was here in the midst of the wave of the first Voluntary Assisted Dying Act in the Northern Territory, and the campaign led by Philip Niski and Marshall Perrin at the time. And the reaction against that, which came very strongly from the Aboriginal Health Services, wasn't so much based on whether people had a view about euthanasia. It was very much based on the fact that people felt incredibly affronted that here they were dealing with preventable premature death and avoidable death and racism in the health system. And some white fella, a doctor, who people knew, Philip, he was a left-wing progressive person, knew quite a lot of Aboriginal people, teamed up with a right-wing reactionary conservative, at that stage, one-party government, to suggest that a place like the Territory would become the first place in Australia to try something as potentially radical as voluntary assisted dying. So that was the reason people were very angry with it. And to build on two things, a couple of things about the health system, which made people quite angry that anyone would suggest this was the place to trial it. Firstly, people saw hospitals as places you went to die. They didn't see hospitals as places that were helpful in any way. And that was for a number of reasons. The history of the health system in the Northern Territory. So just quickly, the Reverend John Flynn built the first hospital in Central Australia in 1927. That hospital, in spite of how sick Aboriginal people were, I mean, the 1918 flu epidemic wiped out at least a third of the Aranda Nation. That hospital that was built by John Flynn was only for non-Aboriginal people. The Reverend Dogood, who was in the same church, complained at the time, said this is racist. He wrote everywhere. He wrote to the Commonwealth government. He wrote to the Privy Council in Britain, really ran a very effective campaign, led to the Commonwealth government coming to town saying, we'll fund a brand new hospital for Alice Springs as long as it's for everyone. So the Reverend John Flynn, who's a very significant racist, and that's not part of the story that's told about him, and the council told the Commonwealth government to keep their money. There's no way they would share a hospital with Aboriginal people. So there's a stalemate till 1934. Then there's an agreement to build the new hospital. That was a big hospital with lots of staff. That became the place for non-Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people got Adelaide House with just one doctor, and it was a very small place. Then after the Second World War, Aboriginal people were allowed onto the verandas of the big hospitals, separate linen, separate cutlery, second-rate medical care. Alice Springs Hospital wasn't desegregated till 1969, and Congress started in 73. So there's that history of overt racism, which didn't stop just because the hospital was desegregated. But more importantly, with the policy of the forced removal of children, it was the hospitals that played the central role in the removal of children. So Aboriginal mothers with dying babies would not even go near the hospital unless they thought their baby was about to die, because they knew once they went there, if it was a so-called half-caste child, they would get treated, but the hospital would find out the names of the parents, where they lived, and within as soon as they went home, they had to go bush and hide for years, because the Native Welfare Branch would be at them to remove their children. So there's that history of those two elements of the history of racism. But more importantly than that, people's experience in the mid-90s was absolutely the hospitals were killing people. When the Royal Commission came in 1991, we put forward 8 cases of people that had died really in tragic circumstances in the hospital system and tried to get that admitted as evidence. because we said it wasn't a case of people dying young in jail. In jail, people were much healthier. What was happening in the hospitals is what should have been subject to the Royal Commission. The Northern Territory government took out an injunction against those 8 cases. They were never allowed to be submitted as evidence. But just to give you a feel for some of them, one was a 34-year-old Warramunga woman who was the first teacher. She developed preeclampsia with her 3rd pregnancy. I sent her to hospital in Alice Springs to be cared for. Should have been straightforward. On a weekend, a GP anaesthetist decided to do an emergency Caesar. He wasn't competent in doing an epidural, so didn't offer an epidural. Anaesthetizer put the tube in her stomach. She didn't open her file and read it, didn't realize that she couldn't be intubated. That was recorded in her file, didn't offer an epidural because didn't know how to do it. Put the tube in her stomach, killed her. The baby was born with severe brain damage. Then there was a 33-year-old woman, disabled woman from a community called Alikarung, came to Tanner Creek Hospital with severe bed sores, life-threatening bed sores. The hospital doctors decided not to treat her because the fact that she was in that state represented the fact that the family wanted her to die, because traditionally they let disabled people die. That was bullshit. But there was one of the doctors was married to an anthropologist, so she thought she knew all about Aboriginal culture. So they didn't treat that woman and let her die. Many other examples I could go. A 27-year-old man who had fulminant liver failure, I sent him for a liver biopsy because that's what the physician told me to do. They did the biopsy. They put him on the bus back to Tanner Creek on the same day they did the biopsy. He got back to Tanner Creek at 9 o'clock at night. We didn't know he was coming. He walked to my house, knocked on the door, just said he needed help and collapsed through the door and died. He'd bled all the way back in the bus. So I could go on. I've got 64 examples of what the hospital system was doing to Aboriginal people in the 90s. So it was on this background that people were absolutely horrified that anyone would suggest that the hospital system could play a role in actually killing people, which is what they saw. So that has now completely been transformed. So, like in the late 90s, the data that just come out in 1999, Aboriginal men were living to be 56, now it's 65. Women were living to be about 63, now it's 69. So there's been a big improvement in the last 20 years, and all that improvement has been led by improvements in the health system. The primary healthcare system has been revolutionised, but so has the hospital system. So the election of the first Labor government was 1991. Within 3 years, Alice Springs Hospital went from $50 million to $150 million. So the health system's been transformed now, and people see it. People no longer see the hospitals as a death trap. Cultural safety has been addressed to a significant extent. There's still issues with racism in the health system, but it's just a quantum leap different to what it was back then. So if now there's a contemporary debate about voluntary assisted dying, I think we're in a situation now where people could engage with that debate in a completely different way to what happened in the mid-90s. But and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. We'll come back to a lot of those issues in the discussion, I'm sure. And our last speaker is Ian Olver. You've met Ian before. He's a palliative care physician and oncologist, and also a chief investigator on the project. Thanks, Ian.
Good. Thanks very much. It's difficult to follow those last two. I come to you from Adelaide, from the lands of the Kaurna people, from the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. So I just want to make a few comments in 2 or 3 slides on how the VAD debate has changed over the decades, because I have been following that debate and engaging in it really ever since I did a PhD with Peter Singer, who didn't agree with the word I wrote, but made me argue it rigorously. And the sort of arguments from the philosophical point of view that we used to advance, 20 or 30 years ago were based on things like, well, why do we value life at all? And there was a sort of religious view, the Judeo-Christian view, that it was God valued and therefore we should. There was philosophers like Immanuel Kant who based valuing human life on rationality, where to be ends, not means. But in fact, there were some practical issues that were raised as well, like, for example, could you actually make a reasoned decision to choose death over life? And Philip Devine talked about the logical opaqueness of death, that we could know life, but we couldn't know what death was. We could have a faith of what death was, or we could take a gamble that it was better than life, that we couldn't know. So how could we make he called it a rational, but basically it's a reasoned or balanced decision. And what, in the philosophical literature, I guess, what euthanasia means is that you value individual autonomy over valuing life, if you put it on a hierarchy of what you value. And this can be challenged on a number of grounds. One of them, clearly, autonomy requires life. There's also, it's not easy, even if you put autonomy on top of what you value, to decide whether, in fact, you're talking about the autonomy to pursue life's goals over the whole lifetime, or the autonomy of the present when you might be in a difficult situation of suffering, and which takes precedence. So it's not a straightforward issue even then. And then, of course, there's John Stuart Mill, who championed autonomy in terms of the state not being able to make decisions for people unless the grounds were harm to others. But even he, in defending autonomy, had to say, well, there's one autonomous decision you can't make, and that's to give away your autonomy altogether, or as he put it, you can't sell yourself into perpetual slavery. So it didn't seem that autonomy was a very strong thing to be the thing that we highest value. And what the original debate was about, irrespective of where you were, was, will euthanasia or VAD erode some sort of societal respect for individual lives? And that was the issue that kept sort of coming up over the debate. So, 20 or 30 years, it was a minority that supported euthanasia, and now we have the majority supporting it. What happened over that time? Well, I think the first thing was the rise of individualism. We hear all the time, it's my body, I can do what I like with it. No one's got any right to counter that because it's my autonomous right to do that. And individualism, society has changed towards more of that than there used to be, irrespective of what effect it may have on the rest of society. In fact, arguments based on harm to others really had no cut through in the current debate. I did address parliamentarians in Tasmania and, in fact, in South Australia. And although I think conscience votes are very important, the Tasmanian opposition, the Labor Party at the time, I vote as a bloc because of the political benefit of doing that. But the argument that was sort of put aside a little was that we had royal commissions and so on talking about the vulnerable people in nursing homes who currently were not having their autonomous choice of a dignified end to their life respected, and into that we were going to throw the option for state-sanctioned dying. Voluntary assisted dying. Was that the best time? Were these people at any sort of risk of not having their choices respected, given that they weren't having and still aren't at this time? From the political point of view, certainly the politicians I talked to perceived that as a popular position. And I don't think they engaged with certainly any of the issues we used to engage in the beginning. And the popular position, certainly in the press, was always presented as suffering versus death as the alternatives you had. So to say that if you weren't compassionate, then you'd let someone suffer, otherwise you had to allow them to choose death. And of course, that was never the case in people because of the ability to relieve suffering, or in fact to give people a sense of what their life was worth despite suffering. And I always use the example of the marathon as being a non-contentious example of where you actually, after 35 kilometres, hurt all over, but you press on because there's something greater that you want to achieve. And in life's case, it might be, and that's a little picture at the bottom of me finishing the Melbourne Marathon in 2018, and it did hurt. But nonetheless, you know, people do have other things. They might use a time to, when they're coming towards the end of their life, to repair relationships or to even consider spiritual things when they've been sort of too busy doing the physical things and so on. So there may be things that they would make their life valuable despite any sort of suffering. And it's a bit distressing, I guess, that we haven't actually seen palliative care and counselling available to a vast majority of people in rural, outer suburban areas, the Aboriginal population and so on, and the access which may have helped people through a decision about whether there were alternatives to voluntary assisted dying. We haven't seen that better funded to date. Now, how quickly can the change? I've been talking, this is my last slide, I've been talking about sort of a change in the debate over decades, but with COVID, we've seen a change in priorities where economics and politics suddenly became a higher societal value than reducing the death rate, and that occurred over months. And that's what happens in an economically rationalist society. So up until November, we had 4,000 deaths from COVID in Australia. Between January and July, we've had another 6,000 because we've put an emphasis on other things than trying to preserve life in that situation. So society can change very quickly. We also know from international experience that the restriction in access to VAD becomes more liberal over the years. I don't care really whether you call it a slippery slope or the evolution of people's opinions, but what does this mean for our legislation? Well, people are looking at various flaws like the inability to accurately predict prognosis, which the legislation was seen to demand, but it may not matter if we're going down, if we know from Belgium and from Canada that we're likely to end up with a far more liberal view of who's eligible for euthanasia. And so as a result of that, we do need to keep monitoring the VAD impact on patients, relatives, the suicide rate, deaths attributable to VAD, which would be easier if it could be recorded on a death certificate, which to me would only mean it being reclassified as not suicide. And we need to look at what's happening with palliative care and how people can access palliative care when they're trying to determine what the rest of their life and the value of the rest of their life will be. And we need to keep debating that because society can change, the law can change, and I think you've only just got to look at what's happened in the abortion area of Roe versus Wade in the USA to show how quickly things can change and to show that we need to keep looking at the contentious issues in this debate. And I'll stop there because I think that's about as many contentious issues as I could put into 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ian. You might be right about that. So look, they were 5 provocative and rich talks that raise so many issues. We're not going to be able to cover all of them, but everyone here is invited to participate. Can I suggest that we start with the issues that have been raised so powerfully by Nicole and John about Aboriginal people and the implications in relation to racism and inequities in the health system, and then move to some of the other issues that I think Ian Olver really gave us quite a good overview about. I might ask Sophie Lewis if, Sophie, Cameron put in the chat a reference to the Victorian Parliamentary report and the discussions that occurred. You've looked specifically into the details of the debate that have occurred in relation to Indigenous peoples. Do you want to comment on what you've heard?
Sure, and thank you so much for those really powerful talks. I guess a lot of the issues that were raised in the law reform processes in both Western Australia and Victoria reflected some of the issues that Nicole, John and Ian have talked about. We had a look at the law reform processes in WA and Victoria and how First Nations perspectives were consulted and engaged with in those reforms. In Western Australia, the Aboriginal organisations who made submissions to the Parliamentary Committee, including the Aboriginal Health Council and Aboriginal Legal Service, talked about similar things to what Nicole raised around respecting individual autonomy about end-of-life decisions and respecting the diversity of Indigenous cultures, views, experiences and spiritualities in guiding the dying process and end-of-life care. They also raised the issue of unequal and restricted access to palliative care and VAD, particularly in remote communities, and the real need for improvements in culturally appropriate care and support to enable people to make informed decisions about VAD. So they talked a lot about assisted dying care navigators with local knowledge about the needs of the communities in which they're working, resources to support people to die on country, and the critical role of the community-controlled health services in the implementation of VAD. When we compared that to the Victorian example, there was actually much less documented evidence of consultation with Aboriginal organisations during the process of reform. And I guess something that I would be interested to hear from others is, why might that have occurred? What the impacts might be of that? And more broadly, how can we think about this in informing future legislative reforms in other jurisdictions, but also for the evaluation of VAD in Victoria?
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll ask Nicole and John to comment a bit further, and then I'm going to ask Sally Greenaway, who's put an interesting comment in the chat. Nicole, you talked about the diversity of opinions amongst Aboriginal people, that there's just because people are Aboriginal, just because they belong to one particular ethnicity, doesn't mean they have a single point of view. So, and that needs to be negotiated. But the negotiation process or the reflection process is also highly culturally determined, isn't it? Would you like just to talk a little bit about the discussion process?
Well, I suppose, it depends where you are and what family you're engaging. Reasons for why, Victoria might have not been as involved in consultation might have been the timing of it. They have also been, very caught up and absorbed in treaty down there. So, when you're sort of undertaking that, I think for many Victorians, the feeling is it's just a legislation not for us. And, most of the rest of the country, our access to palliative care is so poor. The chance that we would have the opportunity to access VAD is very unlikely. Of course, it's not impossible. There are, cases where people have broken down all those barriers and received culturally responsive care. But in Victoria, I feel it's been quite poor. And I don't know the ins and outs of how organisations like the Victorian Aboriginal Community Control Health Organisation were engaged. If they were, how they were. They typically have a really good partnership with both the department, the Commonwealth Department, and the State Department through the Victorian Advisory Council on Koori Health. So I would have imagined that there was opportunities there to raise and engage and consult with the Victorian community, but how that unfolded and what happened, I couldn't say. But what I can say is that palliative care has still got a long way to go. So, we're not at that point of, discussing VAD.
Thanks, Nicole. John Boffa. John, in your powerful talk, you discussed you know, the rather egregious tradition, if you can call it that, relating to the way in which white settler culture has treated Aboriginal people. Has the damage been so profound that it would just not be possible to broach this issue in a successful way now?
I think it would be possible to broach it in the context at the same time of a genuine commitment to finally properly address racism in the health system. And what I mean by that, and if that was, so there has to be transparency and accountability that these things are being, before you add into the mix the potential for the health system to euthanize people, we don't want to undermine confidence in it. And although things have improved a lot, there's some really concrete steps that are yet to be taken. Like, for instance, Congress met with the new board of the Royal Flying Doctor Service about 4 weeks ago. They've committed to a truth-telling process. They have museums. None of their museums, this story about John Flynn has to be told. And if you try and tell it, you get threatened with legal action until very, very recently. I mean, you know, when Albert Namatjira had his heart attack in 1953, the RFDS refused to go and get him in Indari. You tell that story, they threaten you with, until recently. So they're prepared to look at that and tell their history. But at the same time, Congress worked with the AHW on a great report which looks at objective indicators that will tell us that we're actually moving beyond the racism in the health system. Now, they include things like transparently reporting on the proportion of people who take their own leave, the proportion of people who leave against medical advice, and they're two very different things. The proportion of people who leave without their medications, the proportion of people who present to an emergency department with chest pain, who get access to the normal routine range of tests by race, access to angiography by race. There's a range of things you can do that could be that would enable people to be confident that finally the system is taking seriously institutional racism. None of that's happened yet. I don't think there's a hospital in Australia that's agreed to report on the KPIs in the AHW report on addressing racism and cultural safety. So if you were to bring the discussion in at the same time as saying, look, we're serious about addressing racism in the health system and going to the next level, truth telling in the health system, like the stories, you know, we know about what happened, that's not out there yet. So people are very keen on the Voice and the Makarrata, but also the Truth Telling Commission and things like that. If those things start to happen, and this was one part of, and then you've got the more profound issues of ongoing poverty, you know, educational attainment, all this overcrowding not being addressed as well. And so I think, but I think just sticking to the health system, I think if there was a genuine commitment to address properly cultural safety and institutional racism in a transparent and accountable way, people would feel confident that if you added euthanasia into the system, it's not going to be used in an appropriate way.
Okay, thanks so much. Sally Greenaway, I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much. I'm just really enjoying these workshops. Look, as I think I said last time, I'm a palliative care physician and clinical haematologist in Western Sydney, and I've got a very pragmatic approach to voluntary assisted dying, and really my concerns are, will the suffering in the last year of life be less or more for more or less people? And I'm very conscious that the legislation is predicated on, as it says in the first statement of principles, that all lives are of equal value. But the facts are that is not the lived experience of our Indigenous people, or people with disabilities, or refugees, or minority groups, or elders from any cultural group. So there's a whole bunch of people who already don't feel particularly valued or safe in the health system because of racial bias or other cultural bias or lack of equity and opportunity. And I'm very aware that, you know, in an extraordinarily diverse LHD, we spend most of our time telling people we're not euthanizing their loved ones by giving them opiates or helping them with pain control. We're not accelerating their death. That, you know, so I've been very reflective about, sorry, I'm not having an asthma attack, I'm walking. Very reflective of whether this will help or hinder quality care in the last year of life for more people. And we've legislated for a very narrow demographic. If you look at all the legislation in all the jurisdictions around the world, the vast majority of people are from the global north and have some sense of agency over their life. And I do think the public debate's been so extraordinarily narrow, and we haven't heard from so many groups. So I do fear for the implications of this legislation in the sort of demographic that I am fortunate enough to serve. And, you know, it's going to be hard. So it's just a thought and a perspective.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Can I ask Ian Kerridge and then Cameron Stewart to comment? And Ian, I'm really asking you to kind of respond to what we've just heard in the context of what Ian Olver put to us about the potential risks and uncertainties associated with voluntary assisted dying or euthanasia. Do we have the safeguards, or maybe even if you'd like to address the question of autonomy and individualism versus the weight of contrary ethical argument? Have to unmute.
Sorry, in my presentation, I made the point at the end that I think we need to be alert to the possibility of adverse outcomes. And it would be sort of hubris to suggest that there isn't any possibility of adverse outcomes. The challenge for me is that I think the points made by Nicole and John and Sally, you know, and Ian are absolutely spot on. You know, there are these issues of race and gender, of disableism, of ageism, all of these which characterise our health system and characterise our country. The question for me is that whether we can have all of these discussions concurrently. I mean, you know, if we were to wait until we've resolved issues of race and gender, of cultural discrimination, we're going to be waiting an awfully long period of time in Australia before we have discussion about agentic decisions at the end of life. You know, arguably it's only been in this last 2 years that we've really taken seriously questions of gender and sexual discrimination in Australian politics and Australian political life. You know, and it's been the March for Equity movements and so forth that's actually done that. I agree with John and Nicole. I think we've only just started to take racism seriously in our health system as well. So I'm struggling. I'm genuinely struggling to think, you know, can we do all of these things concurrently? I'm probably optimistic. I think we can think seriously about choices at the end of the life at the same time as we're thinking about, you know, gender discrimination and you know, discrimination against, you know, sexual preference and discrimination against the elderly. We could even have discussions about, you know, whether our aged care system is appropriately designed for purpose, you know, whether we should be leaving it to religious groups and to the private sector to run our aged care system, when all of the you know, the evidence points the other way around. I mean, these to me are really important discourses, and perhaps it's things like COVID-19, so the pandemic, and VAD that have actually opened up spaces for us to talk about, you know, these kinds of issues a bit more. Certainly COVID-19 has done that. You know, that's opened up discussion about race in this country, in the United States, in ways that other types of you know, gentle prompts haven't, and maybe VAD, you know, provides the opportunity for us to do more reflection on meaning and dying and end of life care.
Okay, thank you. And I invite anyone on the panel or in the audience to jump in. Please don't feel you have to wait to be asked by me. Cameron, is it just a matter of numbers? Ian talked about democracy, and Ian Olver talked about the degradation of, you know, neo-rationalist, neoliberal society and so on. Does the law simply follow the numbers?
No, and it shouldn't, because laws are not singular documents that are set in stone, and they always are constantly debated. The law is just another area of contest, and it's particularly important for the First Nations people of Australia to be involved in that contest. And they've had very little opportunity to do that, but I think one of the things that's getting better is their involvement in these processes. I think all of the reports from all the parliaments have talked about the necessity to consult with the First Nations people of Australia, and that's also was reflected in the Canadian experience as well. I think there's a lot to learn from them, as also from their mistakes as well as the things that they did well. And in Canada, of course, you've got First Nations people of Canada, but you've also got the Inuit and the Métis peoples, and so very wide and broad cultural experiences and beliefs that they had to really take seriously. And I think we need to do the same work. We haven't had a good tradition of doing that. And we should be on alert because of what happened. The major challenge, legal challenge to the Northern Territory legislation when it was brought was brought originally by First Nations people in Northern Territory. So it was challenged on that basis. So we really need to involve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in these questions.
I'm really asking you here also, thank you for that answer, but the broader question about the role of the law, not just in relation to First Nations people, but how does it adjudicate these very intense ethical arguments and come to a decision?
Sure. It does two things. It sort of sets up the basis upon which this will now be an activity, and then over time, depending upon what happens, there will be mistakes made. There may be a disaster, and then there'll be pressure put on the laws as they currently stand. What we've seen from Canada is the pressures come from the success of the program. So they've expanded the programs, they've made it larger. They've taken away the limitation on you being terminally ill. So it's related purely to suffering. They've taken away, or they soon will take away, the limitation on people with mental illness not being able to access the laws. So what we've seen in Canada is that the bulk of the population have picked up on this, and it's become used quite a lot in a rather extraordinary way, I think. That's not to say that that would happen here. It may not, and we may have a situation where something bad happens, and then that is put through the public. So this is just going to be an area of contest. Having the legislation in the way that we've got it just creates a focus point for us to consider these things. But Ian is 100% correct. This isn't over. This has to be an ongoing process of debate, and that's what we're going to see now. So this is just the first step was getting the legislation put in place, but the next step will be, how is it enculturated? And what value do people see in it, and whether they trust it or whether they don't trust it. These are all things that we're going to be debating on. People haven't stopped debating these systems in Europe, and they won't stop debating them here.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry, it's Jenny Phillip here, just jumping in. I'm wondering, to what extent do you observe or believe that the law is leading the change versus following the change? So I'm wondering, in Australia, it seems like the successive states, there is some slight loosening in different parts of the legislation across the different states, and I'm wondering if that's what you observe internationally, and is that sort of, as I said, leading, or is it following the public sentiment?
And before Cameron answers, can I just say, I'd like to follow this up and maybe get back to Ian Olver and then Ian Kerridge about the so-called slippery slope idea, whether is established some sort of inexorable process that moves forward to a loosening of restrictions. I know both of you have contrary views about this. Cameron.
Well, there's a bit of relativity here, because you're right, Jenny, that there has been a loosening of the Victorian restrictions because they were idiotic. And unworkable. The idea that you can't raise the issue with a person, but they have to raise it before you can start talking about it. That was silly. So I think there's a degree of fine tuning which has occurred, which is just based on common sense practicality of what relationships are between people in a medical context. It's not the way things work. So some might look at that with horror and they'll say, well, that's hallucinating. But I think for most people, they just say, well, it's just being practical, because you're asking doctors to do the very thing that we're trying to teach them for the last 40 years not to do, which is, please give information to patients. And that Victorian piece of legislation said don't give information to patients. So it's kind of an odd thing. So again, in some places there's been more controls and more regulation. I think that's the experience of the Netherlands. But in other places, the regulation has opened up and more categories of patients get access to it. I don't think it's a slippery slope. That's a description already which makes a normative judgment about the behaviour, right? So you're already saying that it's bad and it's getting worse. I used to spend a lot of my time as a kid sliding down hills with a piece of cardboard, and I loved it. So for me, slippery slopes were wonderful things. So it really just depends on your perspective. If you believe in autonomy and if you believe in people's control over their pain and suffering, then you won't see it as a bad thing for those categories to open up. And if you see it, particularly if you're interested in human rights jurisprudence, and certainly that's how the debates have happened in Canada, because they've based those arguments on human rights arguments that, I've got a disability, why shouldn't I be able to get access to voluntary assisted dying? So, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll go to Ian, the two Ians, but I'm pleading with people to put up their hands or just jump in. Please feel free to do that. And then I'd like to move on briefly, at least, to the question of the role of religion. I know there are a few people here who have quite strong religious beliefs, and I'd like perhaps just to invite a reflection on how your religious beliefs have coloured your own views about this issue. But let's stick with the slippery slope idea. Ian Olver.
Look, the reason that I didn't want to engage in the slippery slope is I understand the arguments about what has to be satisfied for a slippery slope. And the point I wanted to make was that we had some jurisdictions that were decades along the way that had actually liberalised the people that had access to VAD. So that was a fact that we could put into the equation of us that have only just in the last year or so been doing this. So we know that one of the consequences of introducing quite strictly controlled euthanasia or VAD is that decades later it may not be as strict, and knowing that, we need to factor it in. But just a comment that I would really like to make is about the autonomy side of things, and that is that my concern has been, and from my own experience when I practiced as a medical oncologist, that I saw many people who had counselling with palliative care counsellors and so on, who sat beside them and explored with them the value of the rest of their life, and actually changed their view about wanting to die because they saw other alternatives that were valuable to them. And I just wanted to make sure that people were making a truly autonomous decision if they chose voluntary assisted dying. And without a lot of support, we haven't seen much evidence that there is, and the Aboriginal view has been strongly put that they don't get good access to palliative care, let alone the sort of counselling before that. So slippery slope or no slippery slope, you can get to a far more liberal view from this point, and so that has to be taken into account. And just one small comment on religion. I am religious, if you like, but the point is that within a religion there are a whole lot of different points of view depending on how you see the role of compassion versus the sanctity of life, etc., etc. So I don't think we should stamp religion as a particular point of view, even within the one denomination. Often there's a whole range of views on these type of issues. But Ian, go ahead.
All right. Ian, I think we should set up an indie band called the Two Ians. I think that'd be cool. Unfortunately, neither of us are particularly musical, so that whole idea goes. Look, I I think the slippery slope issue is an issue, and it's principally because there's an assumption that change is a slippery slope, and that's necessarily a bad thing. But change is not the same as a slippery slope, and slippery slopes do exist. And I'd sort of characterise a slippery slope as starting from something that is presumed to be a good, ending up at something that is supposed to be a bad. But importantly, it's the characteristics of the change. It's seen as inevitable, as lacking in reflection or in purpose, and it just slides down the slope. And there are instances where that occurs, but equally there might be times where decision making is purposive, it's considered, it's reflective, it's inclusive, it's respectful, it's tolerant, it engages with all relevant stakeholders, and then there's a considered process of reform or change. And if that happens, then that would seem to be a very good thing, not a bad thing at all. Whereas if the former process happened, that's problematic. What Cameron's describing in relation to Victoria, if you start at a stupid position and you come to somewhere better, that's not an example of uncontrolled liberalism, right? That's an example of considered reflection upon the inadequacies of the initial law. And if you've got a law that says you can't talk to people, and you change it, that's not a bad thing. That's not a slippery slope. That's an appropriate change. So I think we need to distinguish between, if you want, good processes or probity of political process leading to reform, and unreflective processes. And the challenge is going to be from this point on, not so much where we've got to, it's, my own view is that in fact the process hasn't been terrible. But as we make changes from this point on, everyone's going to be watching, and the process does have to have characteristics that make it ethical and make it not slippery slopes.
Thank you. Before we get on to the religion issue, and I'm going to ask, I know that, as I said, I know there are people here with deeply held religious beliefs, and I hope you won't mind if I ask you for your reflections on the relevance of that. But just in relation to this last point, or these last few points, maybe I'll ask Tanji about how the decisions are made, because one of the, and Tanji's been thinking, as she said the other day, about the role of financial considerations. And, Ian talked about, the rationalist society and so on. And many of us would consider kind of intuitively that it could be problematic for the difficult, intricate ethical issues associated with voluntary assisted dying to be decided on the basis of cost. So, Tanji, do you want to just make a comment about the extent to which these sorts of considerations may have intruded?
I think it's a really interesting point, Paul. I think that at the end of the day, we like to think that these decisions are individual, but we don't necessarily consider the role of context in those decisions. So we might not think about things like culture, economics, the political context playing into how people make their decisions. We talked a little bit during workshop 2 about the role of cost and how that plays into things. But at the end of the day, it's a very individual decision, and I guess coercion can come into play as well. But at the end of the day, it's an individual choice influenced by a whole range of socio-cultural factors.
Okay, but governments, of course, make decisions and indeed pass legislation on all sorts of criteria, including the budget. And we did talk about that in the earlier workshop, about how decisions, for example, about organ donation and so on, have largely been, or to a significant extent, have been shaped by the cost of the respective treatments.
Paul, can I just make a comment? It's Alex here, just following on from Tanji's point of view. There was one sort of contextual element that I don't think's been sort of highlighted, which is the context of the other, or the significant other. I mean, I'm hearing the word individualism a lot, but individualism is in a dialectic with something else, including communalism or intersubjectivity. And I just remembered from an old mentor of mine, when we were faced with the problem with a patient in the general hospital saying, I want to die, we'd often go to the family and ask the question, do you want him to die? And often the patient would say, I want to die because he wasn't sure that people wanted him to live. And that so one of the therapeutic avenues was to bring him back to the notion that his family wanted him to live. And this seems to make quite a significant difference. So it introduces the notion of kind of belonging and the sort of your relationship with others into the picture. And I think this is in stark contrast to this individualism that seems to be, that's sort of been hammered away here. So I guess I'd place that alongside the sort of the cultural and the religious. I think the role of how you fit in relation to the other is a sort of part of this equation we can't necessarily ignore.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And maybe Jenny Phillip, you've put a comment in the chat about this, but it also refers to Ian's perhaps provocative comments about the value of suffering, what we can learn from it, and maybe some of the palliative care people in the audience. Maybe Naomi Katz would like to comment on that question. Jenny.
So my point in the chat was around, and it's touched on what you said just then, Alex, is how we actually even reach decisions and who helps us reach decisions and how we come to those outcomes. And the legislation and much of what we've been talking about has been that, you know, I as a rational, informed person can make this decision for myself. And clearly I don't exist alone, as Alex just said, but also many other or many groups in society actually reach decisions in a much different way to that. And I'm wondering how the legislation could even sort of work in that situation, or how it aligns or how it doesn't align, and what that means, and whether actually there would be needing to be a different sort of legislation in order to cater for or think about people who reach decisions in different ways. I'm interested in both Nicole's and Ian Olver's views on those, if it's feasible.
Okay. And Naomi, are you happy to make a comment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Paul. I think there's two things that, well, many things come to mind, but two things in response to some of the discussion today that's been incredibly rich and valuable. I think that concept of relational autonomy is really important, and it's one of the tenets of how we practice in palliative care. And I think one of the challenges early on, and sort of thinking about the difference between slippery slope and how we do this better, is really relates to how we think about the relational autonomy and the impact of the person and the family or the carers or the loved ones they have around them. And I guess that goes from the decision or the interest in pursuing voluntary assisted dying, but also the support that we provide alongside for the carers, but and during the process of taking the medication and in bereavement as well. And I've sadly seen situations where, I guess because there's not necessarily a mandate for us, or we need to ask the patient for permission to talk to their loved ones, or the other health professionals that are involved in their care, that we potentially miss an opportunity to think about that sort of relational aspect of care. And then I think the other piece that you're talking about, Paul, really is that the suffering piece, and it really comes back to a part of the discussion we had, I think it was in the second workshop, and really what is our capacity as a society and as a workforce to see, and we've touched on it today in the discussion, but to sit with suffering, but also I guess the distress tolerance that we see, and we talk about it for our families when families are really unable to sit with any degree of distress and wanting everything to be flattened and potentially missing out on the good moments in between the difficult moments. And I guess as a society, how from I guess resilience and sitting with suffering, where are we heading? And I think that's got relevant to how we practice in healthcare. So I guess that'd be my reflections. Thanks very much for asking, Paul.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Peter Hudson, could I ask you if you'd like to make a comment, particularly on this last point about suffering? The way Ian Olver presented it was that there was a kind of splendour in suffering, and it was a potential resource on which we could draw for access to new meanings and so on. Do you see it like that? And do you think that voluntary assisted dying potentially cuts off or abrogates a process of gaining access to new forms of meaning?
I think in answer to your second question, potentially yes. I think in reflecting on the comments just made by Naomi with regard to families, I think there is a scenario currently where most families are very unprepared to support a family member or friend who has advanced disease. And that's the current state. That's really problematic. There's about 30 to 40% of family carers on receipt of palliative care who actually meet the cutoff for psychological distress. So this is already an overburdened population who are suffering dramatically as a consequence of the requirements looking after somebody who needs palliative care. So I do worry about the fact that we're not meeting their needs currently, let alone addressing suffering that could ensue as a consequence of involvement in VAD.
Thank you. And Michael Dooley, would you like to comment? And you know, I did mention the question of religion, and I do know that you have a very deeply held religious beliefs, but please don't feel obliged to talk about personal matters if you don't want to. But I know you've been reflecting very deeply on these issues, given the intensity of your own personal experience here.
Yeah, look, I think it all becomes a personal choice, which we get influenced in a whole range of ways. And as some of you may have known, my family is fundamental Roman Catholic and right to life activists from way back. And when I got asked to be involved, I asked my dad's permission, even though it was only a few years ago and I had become an adult. I sought not so much permission, but wanted to be comfortable that his religious beliefs and my relationship with my father wouldn't be jeopardized in any way. And so it was one of those challenges of how do you balance religion and I think it's quite interesting because even with as a Roman Catholic, there are very, very different views of what the religion is, and whether what's written in the Bible is exactly how it should be interpreted or as guidance. So I suppose I still see myself as a Roman Catholic, and my father doesn't disagree with what I'm involved in, albeit may prefer I wasn't. So I just reflect on it as a personal journey, which I think is good to talk about and good to share, and we all have different perspectives because I think how we interpret our own religion is very different.
Thank you. Thanks for agreeing to talk so personally. I'm going to ask Jennifer Ong to comment. She's made an interesting comment in the chat, and then we are running out of time. To round up, perhaps we could go back to the question of process, and that's what Ian was talking about in relation to the democratic processes, and Cameron was talking about the processes of law. So I'll ask people to just have maybe a last reflection on that. Jennifer.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm an academic at the University of Sydney, and I've really enjoyed, I suppose, the conversation around suffering, sitting with suffering, and its impacts on the patient, family, and society. That I sort of conceptualize that on one end of the spectrum, how it affects the individual, but and societal impacts as well. But I do wonder about our experts' opinions on the concept around mercy, you know, the role of VAD around being merciful for the patient, and potentially on carers and the family members that need to observe the suffering. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that bigger question about the impact, not just on the individual patient, but on the wider society. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Ian Olver, I've got to give you another right of reply, and then perhaps I'll hand over to Jenny Phillip to maybe give a bit of an overview of the conversation.
Well, Paul, could I say something about the religion issue as well?
Yeah, please do.
If there's time.
Please go ahead, Ian. Maybe Ian Kerridge first, then Ian Olver, and then Jenny Phillip.
I mean, look, just very briefly, I think Michael's point, and Ian Olver made the same point as well, that we can think more in a more sophisticated fashion about religion. So it's not a single homogenous thing, it's diverse and heterogeneous, and there's a distinction between, you know, dogma and ritual and teaching and authority, and then individual choices made by people of particular faith traditions. That's all wonderful and true. But the thing that makes it a bit more complex in relation to VAD, just as it does for termination of pregnancy or provision of contraceptive services or IVF or even advice about, you know, COVID-19 vaccinations and public health, is that the church is also healthcare providers. And they shape and determine what information should be given out about pandemics and what health services should be available within their hospitals and so forth. And in that sense, you know, I don't think it's enough to say, you know, we should be tolerant of religious diversity. We also need to ask some hard questions about how health services are being shaped by the church. And that kind of discussion I would really like to see in relation to VAD and COVID-19, opening that up, because certainly that's an impact in rural and remote areas, but it's also an impact in urban areas as well.
So it's not just a matter about personal conscience.
No, it's far more than just the choices that individual practitioners make or individual patients make. It's also about the choices they're able to make.
Yeah, and the logic of the institutions themselves.
Yeah,
thanks.
Yeah.
So Ian Olver, a quick comment.
So a very quick comment. I'd just like to put forward an image that you've all seen. It's an image of an individual's face, but when you look closely at it, it's made up of thousands of smaller pictures of people and so on. And that's how I actually view the individual's relationship with the society. We're not actually individuals. We're the sum of all sorts of experiences we've had from our parents, our school, our society, our religion, and so on. And so if we consider the impact of something on society, we're actually making our own lives better because we're improving the things that make us up. So I think, although we've talked about individual autonomy, it may be somewhat of a myth, because I think we actually are the sum of all the parts of the society in which we live. And I think we've got to take account of that when we're looking at these big societal issues.
Thank you very much. Jenny Phillip.
Thanks, Paul. This has been an extraordinary discussion and rich and deep, and I just sort of, I guess, just to recap some of the areas that we covered, the whole issue of institutional cultural safety is a key one that's been raised again and again in a number of different ways. I guess including just then about the influence of cultural groups that may be influencing access to information, but very deeply and with a history of that we all should be ashamed of the cultural racism and the systemic racism in many of our institutions, and the practices that has given rise to, and the justified fear of particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around those institutions and what that means for VAD. We have also, related to that, perhaps talked about the impact of equity in terms of access to VAD, but also I guess the impact of costs and what that might mean for decision making both in governments and also individual levels. So the economic context within which people make decisions. We've come back and again to diversity within groups and how the assumptions around how people may decide or not cannot be held to be fast or cannot be assumed, of course, both for people of certain cultural groups or who identify with certain religions. And I think the other, and again, we keep coming back to the notion of change and changing over time, and what that means. Is it good or bad, and the issue of the slope or not, and how this may represent improvements or change, or perhaps responding to equity or some of the influences that we've been highlighting. And then finally, again, throughout these workshops, we've been discussing the nature of suffering, and not necessarily, or not as a means, not as a thing to be endured for itself, or necessarily endured in any way, and not as a means to something else, but it may be that it is occurring, and it may be in the context of end of life and suffering, or not, of patients and or families, that other opportunities may be available. So I guess I'd like to end on that notion of whether VAD is how VAD is played out or available to people, that there is the opportunity for possibility and potential growth for people, even at the end of life, as there is in any other part of life. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for that very helpful summary. So that brings this session to a close. I'd like to thank all the speakers and all the other contributors from the panel and the audience, and thank you for your attendance. Tomorrow there's the last session in this series, in this conference, and the focus tomorrow is how do we determine the way forward? So that's about how do we make sense of all of this? How do we evaluate these multiple experiences that we've been talking about? And how do we refine the processes, the policies, the laws, the ways in which doctors and maybe patients and others act? So that's the topic for tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again, and good night.
Thanks, Paul.